right, welcome. We're just about to get started. Just got a couple seconds left. All right. So welcome to Reading Against Regimes. This is the first edition of this live stream. Just making sure that all my notes are set to go so that I make sure I cover everything that is important. Alright, welcome in everyone. This is Reading Against Regimes, where I analyze dystopian novels and compare them to current events in an effort to fight against tyranny and hopefully spread some positive change within the U.S. So I decided, of course, to start with George Orwell's 1984, because ever since I read this book in high school, I have always felt that it was the most relevant to what we were going through, and to this day I still feel like it is the most accurate. Now I do want to give a little bit of historical context since we're about to dive into the very first chapter. So 1984 was written by, of course, George Orwell, who, that was his pen name actually. His real name was Eric Blair. Now he was actually a militiaman in the Spanish Civil War, and he fought on the Republican or Loyalist side. Now, I know what we think of Republican in the U.S. Now we think of right-leaning, but Republican in the Spanish Civil War actually was a left-leaning political alignment. And so this included socialists, anarchists, communists, and separatists. And this side at the time was supported by the Soviet Union. Now, they were fighting against the nationalist side under General Francisco Franco, and this side, the nationalist side, was made up of fascists, monarchists, conservatives, and traditionalists. So, you know, if any of those terms sound a little bit familiar to what we're seeing in this country currently, yeah, there is a reason for that. So now, Orwell, he was against totalitarianism. He wrote works that were criticizing Stalin's regime and the Nazi regime, because that was the most relevant to what was happening during his period of time. And so he hated what he was seeing in there. He hated seeing how Stalin was controlling essentially every aspect of citizen life, and how his extreme paranoia was driving him to eliminate people that he deemed as spies or against his leadership. And then, of course, we understand the Nazi regime was incredibly horrible because of the Holocaust and how Jews were persecuted and sent to internment camps. And how most of them ended up dying in those camps, and they were tortured, experimented on, all kinds of horrible things. And so this was where Orwell was drawing his inspiration. He himself identified as a democratic socialist, so kind of a combination between socialism and democracy. He was primarily influenced by the Marxist writer Leon Trotsky, who was actually assassinated by Stalin. So anyway, so that's just some historical context on 1984 and like where the inspiration came from for this. So a lot of the symbolism that you're going to be seeing in this book has to do with Stalin and with the Holocaust. Although so far, just from chapter 1, thus far, most of the symbolism that we're seeing actually has to deal with Stalin. So I will explain the historical meaning behind some of the themes that we're going to be investigating today. But at the same time, I'm also going to go into the modern symmetry and comparing it to what we are experiencing now. And hello! Hi, Wolf Unleashed. It's good to see you. Welcome in. I think you'll actually really enjoy this one. So I'm just about to actually start talking about Chapter 1 of 1984. And so I outlined 6 different themes for Chapter 1 to discuss. The first theme that we're going to start discussing is what is known as the Victory Mansions, which is the crappy apartment complex that that Winston, our main character, our protagonist, was living in. So the actual historical significance of these Victory Mansions, so they're incredibly rundown buildings. They're described as rotting, falling apart, walls are sagging, that kind of thing. The elevator doesn't even work most of the time, even when electricity is currently on. So this incredibly dilapidated building that he's living in, and also just the slums that are surrounding, it is actually meant to be analogous to the post-World War II London, after Germany had heavily bombed the area, and so many of the buildings' architecture were destroyed, and you know, falling apart, run down, all of that. Except, hold on, I'm over here. There we go. Okay, so I have notes open on my laptop currently, so that I can actually read some of the quotes from the book, because obviously it's going to take too much time to just read the entire chapter, so I selected some certain quotes just to kind of relate to what we're talking about. So now what we're seeing with these Victory Mansions, and also the scarcity that is in this society. So what we see is the dilapidation of the buildings, all of the slums, the places that people are living in. And so the quotes that I selected here are just saying, the hallways smelt of boiled cabbage and old rat mats, and the lift was seldom working, even when electricity was running. They're described as vistas of rotting 19th century houses. And so what I'm seeing in comparison to what's going on today with that specifically is just how many apartment complexes and other rental residential units, their rent continues to go up year by year, and yet there is nothing being actually updated about the complex. They are still sitting with a lot of the same appliances that that were first installed when they were first built. And you know, in this case, Winston's describing that they're vistas of rotting 19th century houses. So he's talking about buildings that are 100 years old at his point in time. And you know, we're kind of starting. We're about to see that, you know, because a lot of our buildings in the United States, a lot of our rental units were built in the 1900s, which I know I'm very much aging a lot of us by calling it that way, but so we have these buildings that were built a long time ago, and they are just not getting updated, and so, you know, people are essentially having to pay more for something that is starting to fall apart. And I'm sure a lot of y'all have seen that picture where the landlord painted over a roach on the wall, and that's kind of the sentiment that we're getting here in the modern times. Now, there were other scarcities that were mentioned as well in this particular dystopian society of 1984. So Winston himself is actually described as malnourished. So he's described as having a smallish, frail figure, the meagerness of his body merely emphasized by the blue overalls which were the uniform of the party. And then, of course, there's also the description of when he gets back to his flat, finally. He says how he had to miss getting lunch that day, and so even though he was hungry, all he had left in his entire unit was just a chunk of bread, which he said he needed to save for the next day's breakfast. So he's definitely malnourished, and just kind of fading away. There are other scarcities described as he was having to use coarse soap and blunt razor blades, and that was the best that he could purchase. And these razor blades were impossible to get a hold of, as well as shoelaces, except in ordinary shops, which are deemed the forbidden free market. So the citizens are not actually supposed to be shopping at these free markets. They are only supposed to be buying government-approved items. However, things are so scarce in their society that they have no choice but to go this underground route into sort of a black market just to get basic essentials, and not even very good ones. And then another thing that's described is he has this pack of Victory cigarettes, and they're so poorly manufactured that whenever he goes to pick one up, all of the tobacco just falls right out of it. And we're starting to see a decrease in the quality of products that we have, especially in food items. We are seeing packaging getting smaller, and we're seeing things just not being good, and technological things that used to be built to last for years and years, and now they're almost intentionally, well, actually no, they are intentionally being built to fall apart, to start degrading and deteriorating a lot faster, so that we have to keep buying in. And so that's kind of the modern symmetry that we are seeing in terms of the scarcity. Now, the next theme that Chapter 1 highlights is, of course, the propaganda. So the main thing that we're seeing is, as Winston is walking up the stairs to his flat, which he's having to walk up 7 stories, I believe, he describes how on every single floor, on multiple places of the walls around, there are the posters of Big Brother. And Big Brother, of course, is representative of Stalin. And so the description that's given is that Big Brother looks like a man of about 45 with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. And it says that these posters were a meter wide, and they're plastered everywhere. And so what this is demonstrating historically is, of course, representative of Stalin, and how he was idolized and portrayed as someone with superior intelligence and even genetics. And the fact that the posters are everywhere, it demonstrates his harsh control of all aspects of life that made him feel ever present. It also says of the posters, it was one of those pictures which are so contrived the eyes follow you about when you move. Big Brother is watching you, the caption beneath it ran. So a lot of us are familiar with that expression, Big Brother is watching you, and we definitely feel that today, because the government is able to watch everything that we're doing. Now, before I get into that, because there is another aspect of the propaganda theme that I will go a little bit more in depth with, but, kind of what we're seeing is, we're seeing this political propaganda that is widespread and idolizing a leader. And so, what of course we're seeing in the modern times is we are seeing people wear these hideous red caps all of the time to indicate their absolute love for the orange clown that is in office. So, going to the next aspect of the propaganda that exists in this dystopian society is the telescreens. Now, these telescreens, they are essentially televisions that are embedded into metal plaques, and they are actually built into the walls of every person's living unit, and they are set so that ideally they are supposed to be able to have a visual range of the entire unit. And what it says of the telescreens is, it says, the telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously. Any sound that Winston made above the level of a very low whisper would be picked up by it. Moreover, so long as he remained within the field of vision which the metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. The historical meaning behind this was representative of how Stalin was highly accusatory of many of the Soviet Union's politicians and people in power of being spies, and he was determined to root them out. So he had this intense surveillance of everyone, and he felt that he needed to watch absolutely everything that anyone was doing or saying. The modern symmetry, of course. Let's just start with smartphones. We know that our smartphones have been listening in on everything that we've been saying, and so you'll be talking about some random interest, and next thing you know, you're receiving a bunch of advertisements that are related to that interest. So we know that our smartphones have been allowed to listen in on us and use that to curate our algorithm. And now, we don't even have to be actively using the smartphones, of course, for this to be happening. Our screens could be dimmed, we could have our phones flipped over and down, but they're listening to us at all costs. And it does say, of course, of the telescreens about this. It says the telescreens could be dimmed, but never turned off. Now, so we may be able to turn off our smartphones, but, you know, at the same time, most of us are not turning off our phones ever, like, let's be real. So that means that we're actually being listened to and perceived at all times. Now, of course, we also have, so of the telescreens, they're kind of like broadcasting news. And so they're talking about like the stocks and, you know, all of these wonderful things that the government is doing. And it's just constantly pushing the ideas that this society is wonderful. And so what we see, of course, is on social media in general, we get advertisements, propaganda, and rage bait pushed on us constantly. And what we're seeing in the modern world that is really unfortunate is that, especially on Spotify and TikTok, we are seeing, we're hearing a lot of people talking about all of a sudden they're receiving these increased Frozen Task Force advertisements. And then, of course, we're also being threatened for posting anything in resistance to this this Frozen Task Force. So now, I don't actually know how valid this is. I don't know if it's just a rumor, if it's just more rage bait. But, you know, there have been rumors going around very recently that the U.S. government is intending to crack down on people who are speaking out against the current regime. And so that's highly concerning. Now, okay, one other thing I wanted to mention, though, of course, about just the constant surveillance and the lack of control that we have. So even though I was talking about how most of us don't turn our phones off, but let's say that we do, and let's say that we're thinking that nobody's listening to us. Something that, of course, I have noticed is that even when our computers are powered down for the night, they are still receiving commands to update in the middle of the night. And if it's powered down, why exactly, how is it receiving this command, and why is it happening? Why is it not requiring our consent to agree to this update? So we definitely have this feeling very akin to the telescreens of just us constantly being watched and having information pushed on us that we don't even necessarily want. Alright, so now along that line, the next theme that appears in chapter 1 is talking about the thought police. And of course the historical context is relevant of Stalin's heavy surveillance of everyone in his country. So the thought police, they do mention that there are these police patrols, and so they're essentially these people who are just, they're police who are flying around in helicopters, and they're kind of just like sinking in between apartment buildings just so they can snoop into people's windows. And so that's just kind of another comparison of how smartphones are always listening in on us. But also, it can be indicative of the frozen task force raids of schools and other facilities, how they feel that they need to be sticking their nose into everything, and just appearing wherever they want, whether they are welcome or not, which they are not welcome ever. Now, what I added as a note with regard to the thought police. So the thought police are exactly what they sound like they are. They are people who are trying to burrow into everyone's minds, and they are looking for any signs of resistance. And so that is why they are able to tap in through these telescreens at any given time, whenever they want, so that they can be watching people's actions and listening to the things they're saying to make sure that nobody is speaking out against the regime. And the quote that I selected here to read was, "You had to live, did live, from habit that became instinct, in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and, except in darkness, every moment scrutinized." And I do believe that that is the end goal of us being constantly surveilled. Because Big Brother is always watching. The government is buying social media outlets, and they are paying attention to specific hashtags and specific language that's used in captions, to be able to filter out things that they don't want. And I worry about this stream that I'm doing now getting me in trouble, because I am speaking out against what's happening currently, and we're always being watched. I'm just kind of counting on the fact that, since I'm a small creator, that I am kind of just a small insect to them, and that they won't notice me, and hopefully I can reach a bunch of people before something happens to my account. But the ultimate goal is that they want to be able to watch us at all times and know everything that we're thinking, so that they can punish those who are trying to resist. They want us to be in fear. They want us to be afraid to speak out. And, my life has not been super easy. I've gone through a lot. But I am privileged. Even though I've had a lot of obstacles in my life, I am privileged. And I believe that I have a responsibility, as someone with privilege, to use my voice, because I am in less danger than people without my amount of privilege. And that's why I'm doing this stream in the first place, is because I want to use my privilege and my voice to reach more people, because I believe that education is going to lead to awareness, which leads to empathy, which leads to inspiration, and finally leads to action. Because I want to see change. I want to see people feel inspired to do something. I don't want to see people feeling too afraid to speak out. Because we are being fear-mongered right now. And if we give in, there is a point where it will become too late for us to do anything about what we're currently experiencing in the United States. And so I hope that it's not too late for starting a stream like this. I hope that this actually can make a difference. It's the most that I can do, unfortunately, since I'm very sickly. And so, unfortunately, I'm not able to participate in a lot of physical in-person activities, like in-person protests and things like that. I have some kind of chronic fatigue thing going on, and so that keeps me very limited in what I'm able to do. And so this is the only thing that I was able to think of that I could do. But let me see. Oh, I got another comment on my other thing. I'm streaming this on like 3 different platforms at the same time. So in case one of them gets shut down, like, hey, they can't silence me that easy. They're gonna have to clock me on 3 different ones. But yeah, someone said they're getting on another watch list like every couple of minutes, and it's like, yeah, it's very true. Like, I know that there's this imminent threat of us getting put on some kind of watch list, and that something bad's gonna happen to us, you know. But again, just to kind of go back to like me having privilege, like that's why I want to use my voice as much as I can before it's too late. But anyway, so I've spent enough time on that, and I do want to go into the next theme of chapter 1. And so the next theme is regarding Newspeak, and Newspeak in 1984 is the new language that has been developed by the government for this nation. And there are a few different aspects of it. Chapter 1 does not cover the full impact of what Newspeak does, and so that is something that I will discuss in later streams whenever it actually does describe it a little bit more. But what I can talk about so far is the first thing that you see with Newspeak is the party slogans and the 4 ministries. So the party slogans are war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And so obviously it's just outright saying things that are not true. It's a form of gaslighting. And then if you want to go into the names of the 4 ministries and what they actually represent, 2 of them in particular are along this line of gaslighting. But the other ones are as well. It's just not as obvious at this point in the book just yet. So there's the Ministry of Truth for news, and that's the ministry that Winston works for. There's the Ministry of Plenty for economic affairs, and that's one of the less obvious ones because everyone's living in these dilapidated rental units and everything is incredibly scarce. So calling it the Ministry of Plenty when clearly people do not have enough, that one's pretty rough. And I think a lot of us are feeling that right now. We do not feel like we have plenty. We feel like we are living in scarcity. The Ministry of Love, which is for law and order. And I don't know about y'all, but law and order does not feel very loving to me. And then last but not least, the Ministry of Peace, which is for war. And so this is where the Newspeak comes in, because even though this is not specific language just yet at this point, the point of Newspeak is to essentially remove people's power by removing certain words from vocabulary, so that eventually the people do not have any words to describe any of the negative things that they are facing under the regime. And so what it kind of starts with is just calling things something that they are not. So saying war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And it's very akin to our Orange Clown's constant gaslighting of the public, and how he claims that the economy is better than it's ever been, and yet minimum wage is still stagnant. The cost of living, the cost of groceries has increased just constantly year after year, and people are struggling. you know, people are having to work multiple jobs just to barely even make it. A lot of us are struggling to find proper health care, myself included. Um, you know, and gods, I just can't even. There's just like, there's not much more I can say, right? It's just, it's just, we let these politicians just flat out lie to us, and we let them just say, oh, everything's so great, everything's so wonderful, America is great, you know, and it's like, you know, most of us are not doing well, okay? A lot of us are incredibly stressed. We are not making enough money. We're not able to afford proper health care. We're having to cut corners everywhere. Rent is constantly going up, and we're struggling to make enough money just for our basic essentials. You know, we're not doing well. And so I want to keep going into the full intention and impact of Newspeak, which is that ultimately what Newspeak is, it is the shortening and even deletion of words from people's vocabulary. So now, the four ministries, which we had just mentioned, their names actually get shortened. And so this is the first instance that we see of vocabulary being altered. So the ministry of truth is shortened to mini-truth. The ministry of plenty is shortened to mini-plenty. The ministry of love is shortened to mini-love. And the ministry of peace is shortened to mini-facts. Now, we use contractions, right? Like don't being do not. And using contractions is not dumbing us down. However, the intention of Newspeak, by shortening the words, is the intention is to dumb society down. It's like we're gonna make everything really, really simple because we don't want people thinking too hard. We don't want people to have critical thinking skills, and so we're just gonna make language as easy and simple as possible, and reduce creativity. So what they do now for mini love. Mini love is actually spelled incorrectly, so it's mini and then L-U-V, and so that's just kind of an instance of, you know, kind of dumbing down the language for everybody. And like I said, the Newspeak, it does get covered a little bit more in later chapters, but another thing that gets mentioned in chapter 1 is there is this implication that the words illegal and law are in the process of being deleted from their vocabulary. Because at one point in chapter 1 it says, nothing was illegal since there were no longer any laws. However, if a person did something that the party did not approve of, in Winston's case, he decides to keep a diary, they would be punished with either 25 years in a forced labor camp, or punished by death. And the forced labor camp, this was actually a direct comparison to how Stalin would punish opposers, because he would actually send people to forced labor camps in Siberia, which has incredibly harsh winters, and the intention was for them to either starve or freeze to death in these labor camps. So that is actually a direct comparison. And so illegal and law, because we're saying, again, nothing was illegal since there were no longer any laws. However, obviously, there is something illegal. There is some kind of law because there is a punishment for behavior that the government does not approve of. Okay, and the fifth theme that I wanted to talk about is the concept of something called Thoughtcrime. And now we've already been kind of talking about how there's this constant surveillance happening over every single citizen. And thought crime is exactly what it sounds like. It is the crime of thinking things that the government does not approve. And so we've kind of already talked about that, so I don't have to spend too much time on this. But there are these people called the thought police, and they are the ones who are tuning in through the telescreen and watching and listening to everything that people are saying, so that they can actually swoop in and arrest anyone who is saying anything that is in opposition of Big Brother. So I didn't want to spend too much time on that, just because we've already covered it so much at this point. But thought crime, of course, is going to be one of the major themes of 1984, because in Chapter 1 what Winston does is he had stopped by one of these illegal free market shops, or I guess illegal is not really a thing, right? And he purchased a diary, and he decides to keep a diary, and he does mention that even just purchasing the diary was considered thought crime, because it meant that he was desiring to have thoughts independent of the regime. So he purchases this diary, and in Chapter 1 it does actually mention how his first entry into it. And so he has this incident, which I'm about to cover in a minute. That's going to be our last theme of this. But he's writing in this diary, and he's so panicked, because even though he has found a specific little niche in his flat that the telescreen just so happens to not be able to see, and he goes and he hides in there with the diary and decides to write his first entry. His first entry is incredibly erratic and just run-on sentences, and he's panicked because he knows that he is committing thought crime. So first he's just kind of writing about this movie that he saw, where, you know, there was a war that was happening, and there was a Jewish woman who was trying to protect her child, and then she gets killed, and the audience starts laughing. They think that this is hysterical. And so he's just kind of writing these, like, run-on sentences and expressing this, and it's just a very panicked, erratic thing that he does, because it's his first time doing something rebellious. And he's so paranoid that the government is going to find out that he has kept this diary, and they're going to come after him. So, anyway, that's as far as they cover thought crime in Chapter 1, but again, that's going to be something that appears a lot in the rest of the book. So the last theme that I want to cover for Chapter 1 is Hate Week. And so Hate Week is essentially a week that is dedicated to it's a form of propaganda where they force the citizens to watch this blatant mockery of one of the most infamous figures of resistance to the regime. And so the historical context behind this Hate Week is that there is this one particularly deemed enemy of the people, Emanuel Goldstein. And Emanuel Goldstein is actually a reference to the Marxist writer Leon Trotsky, who Stalin had assassinated. And so Winston is inspired to write in the diary because he attends one of the Hate Week's events called the 2 Minutes Hate. And so essentially the citizens gather in this hallway in front of a telescreen, and the telescreen plays this this mockery session, and it portrays this Emanuel Goldstein character as a sheep, and he's just kind of bleating nonsense. And then there's this backdrop of, like, war behind it to imply that it's all his fault that they're at war and everything. Um, and and the idea behind it, like this is mandatory. The citizens have to attend this, and so what ends up happening is they're supposed to be like yelling at the screen, getting super emotional, throwing things at it and whatnot. And Winston, even though he's feeling like he wants to resist this, he says how it just feels impossible not to get caught up in it, because the impact of this constant brainwashing, it just becomes this feverish spread amongst the people, and everyone just kind of gets caught up in it, and they can't help but participate. And you know, we definitely see this. We see a lot of rage bait that is meant to get us all riled up, and we're having to be extremely careful what news we believe, that we see on social media, and even on specifically news platforms. We can't trust everything that we read and see right away. And actually, what I had thought of with the like 2 minutes hate, what it sounds like, honestly, is it just sounds like the political ads where all they do is just like trash the other candidate. You know, it's just kind of they're just wanting to get these feral reactions from people. They're wanting to get people enraged and whatnot. And ultimately, now what we're seeing in the U.S. and not so much in the book of 1984, what we're seeing in the U.S. is more so that us, the citizens, are kind of getting pitted against each other, because if we're too distracted fighting each other all the time, we are not going to be fighting what's happening in the government as hard. And so that was kind of what this reminded me of. And I can't believe it. It's only 7:41, and I've already covered all of the main themes that I had wanted to go over. However, I do remember that I had underlined a specific quote in Chapter 1 that I found really interesting, and I did want to mention it, even though it is not a main theme just yet at this point. Let's see. Where is it? Okay, so now when Winston is talking about the 2 minutes hate that he experienced, he describes this dark-haired girl who is a part of an anti-sex league, and so part of this quote comes from the fact that he is just having these really complicated feelings about her, because he finds her really attractive, but he also believes that she is heavily supportive of the regime, and so he's very emotionally conflicted, and so this is part of it is coming from this. But what he says is something interesting I wanted to highlight briefly. It says, "It was always the women, and above all the young ones, who were the most bigoted adherents of the party, the swallowers of slogans, the amateur spies, and nosers out of unorthodoxy." And so what we're fighting right now is we're fighting the patriarchy, and something that I've been seeing, a post in particular that I've been seeing going around on social media a lot, is talking about, it was especially talking about like Pam Bondi at one point, but saying, you know, we're not just fighting against the patriarchy, we are also fighting against the women who enable it. And we are kind of seeing that with Pam Bondi and Christy Nolan, how they are supporting the patriarchy trying to strip women of their rights. And sorry you guys, I've been like really sick, so I'm hanging there, just barely, but wow. I'm so sorry. I'm just like, I have been really sick. Anyway, so with Pam Bondi and Kristi Noem, they are just a couple of examples of women who we are seeing carry water for the patriarchy, and they are literally supporting having their own rights taken away, and it's ridiculous. And so I just think it was interesting, this one particular quote that that came from Winston, even though part of it came from this weird conflicted emotion that he's having about this one woman. I did see some comparison to something that we're experiencing today, and so I guess I will just briefly kind of just remind y'all of the themes that we had discussed. So the main themes of Chapter 1 were the victory mansions, the dilapidated apartment buildings, and the overall scarcity that we were seeing in society, where people were having to go to the black market, essentially, just to get their basic necessities, because the government was not supplying anything that was going to be supporting the citizens. Then, of course, we have the propaganda with the Big Brother posters and the telescreens that are everywhere, so people always feel like they're being watched, and there's this incredible intimidation factor to try to control how people are functioning, which also leads then into the thought police, which is the next theme. And that just kind of ties right in to the telescreens, because the thought police are using the telescreens to check in on people and make sure that they're not saying or doing anything to oppose the regime. Newspeak was our next theme, and like I said, again, that's going to be one that we cover a little bit more in later chapters, because it does get into that a little bit more. And Newspeak was the shortening and deletion of words to strip the power away from people so that they don't even know how to describe the bad things that they are going through. Then there was Thoughtcrime, of course, which ties back into the propaganda and the thought police. And then lastly was, of course, that insane hate week where everyone was just gathering around to get all ragey together and make a mockery of people who are in opposition to the regime. And it's only 7:46. I thought that this was actually going to take me a full hour, but you know, I'm glad that I was able to get through the important themes. And so I guess I will go ahead and end the stream a little bit early, because I am exhausted, and obviously from my little brain fog moment that I just had earlier, I do probably need to get some rest. But 1984, it's a fantastic book, and ever since I read it in 2010, it has stuck with me all these years later because of just how relevant of a comparison it makes to our current society. And I saw back then, in 2010, that we were heading in this exact direction. And that's why I find it so important to cover this book first. I do actually want to eventually cover other dystopian novels. Now, I'm only doing this stream twice a month, so it may take me forever just to get through 1984. I don't know when I'm going to get into other dystopian novels, but there are other ones that I'm very interested in as well, especially The Handmaid's Tale, because ever since the overturning of the Roe versus Wade ruling, and now we have seen abortion rights being stripped across the country, and how people are under threat if they decide to drive out of state to go and get an abortion and things like that. I did want to eventually go over The Handmaid's Tale, so I thought that was very interesting. I also have never read Fahrenheit 451, but that one sounds really interesting. And there are some other ones that I have on a list as well. Of course, Brave New World is one of them. I have read Brave New World, and that was actually another one that I had been assigned to read back in high school. And that was kind of interesting, but I do feel like that one is more, more, it just felt more sci-fi, you know, it just felt a little bit too bizarre, you know, to be incredibly accurate, but it is still a very important book, and actually Brave New World was written before 1984, which I was completely surprised about that. But anyway, I will go ahead and wrap it up. So thank you guys so much for tuning in for 1984. I hope you guys enjoyed this analysis and comparison of Chapter 1 to what we're currently experiencing today. The next one will be in 2 weeks. So anyway, everyone have a good night, and I will see you guys soon.